In the year 832 AD, a foreign army marched into the largest city in Southeast Asia. They burned the temples. They tore down the walls. And they took 3,000 of its citizens, engineers, priests, dancers, scholars, and walked them, in chains, over 1,000 kilometers north, into the mountains of southern China. The city was never rebuilt. Its people were never seen again. Within 2 generations, the language they spoke was forgotten. The script they wrote was unreadable. The kingdom they had built, a kingdom that had stood for over 1,000 years, longer than the Roman Empire, vanished from human memory so completely that when British surveyors stumbled onto its ruins in the 1800s, the local villagers had no idea who built them. This is the story of the Chuo, the most advanced civilization you've never heard of. But before it vanished, the Chuo built a world unlike anything Southeast Asia had seen. To understand the Chuo, you have to understand what Southeast Asia looked like 2,000 years ago. It was a world of river valleys, monsoon forests, and open plains waiting for cities to rise. Today, we call it Myanmar, or Burma. But in 200 BC, there was no Myanmar. There were no Burmese people. The land was a patchwork of jungle, river valleys, and rice plains, sparsely populated by tribes whose names we do not know. And then, sometime around the 2nd century BC, a new people appeared in the dry zone of central Burma. They came from the north, most likely descending from the Tibetan plateau through the river valleys. They spoke a language related to modern Tibetan and Burmese. They called themselves something we can no longer pronounce. The Chinese, encountering them later, would call them the Piao. We know them today by a name given to them by their conquerors, the Chuo. They arrived quietly, not as conquerors, but as settlers following the rivers into the heart of Burma. They were farmers. They were metalworkers. And they were builders. By 100 AD, the Chuo had done something no one else in Southeast Asia had done before. They had built cities. Not villages. Not fortified camps. Cities, planned, walled, with palaces, monasteries, reservoirs, and irrigation networks that would not look out of place in the Roman world of the same era. We know of at least 18 Chuo cities. The 3 largest were called Bagan, Hallan, and Shriksetra. Shriksetra was the greatest of them. The name means city of splendor. Its outer walls enclose an area of nearly 18 square kilometers, larger than the walled portion of ancient Rome, larger than medieval Paris, larger than any other city in Southeast Asia for the next 1,000 years. The walls were made of fired brick, millions of bricks, each one identical, each one made in standardized molds. The city had a moat. It had a citadel. It had palaces for the king and his court, and outside the walls, vast complexes of stupas and monasteries. And it had something even more extraordinary, something archaeologists did not understand until they began excavating in the 20th century. Shriksetra had plumbing. Buried beneath the streets were terracotta pipes that carried fresh water from reservoirs to the city center, and removed wastewater to outside the walls. The reservoirs themselves were engineering marvels, massive earthen tanks, each capable of holding millions of liters, fed by canals that captured the seasonal monsoon rains and stored them for the dry months. For comparison, London would not have a comparable water system until the 1600s. The Chuo had one in 100 AD. That is how advanced the Chuo were, centuries before the rest of the region caught up. The Chuo were Buddhists, among the earliest Buddhists outside of India. When Buddhism began spreading from its birthplace in northern India around the 3rd century BC, it traveled in 2 great directions. One stream went north, eventually reaching China, Korea, and Japan. The other went southeast, and the Chuo were one of the first peoples it reached. By 400 AD, Shriksetra was a Buddhist city in a way that no other Southeast Asian city was. Hundreds of stupas rose above its walls, bell-shaped towers of brick and stucco, painted white and gold, visible from miles away across the rice plains. Inside the city, monks copied sacred texts onto gold plates, sheets of pure gold, thin as paper, inscribed with the earliest known Pali Buddhist scriptures in the world. Let me say that again, because it deserves emphasis. The oldest surviving Buddhist texts on earth, not the oldest copies of the texts, but the oldest physical scriptures, were written by the Chuo. On gold. 1,500 years ago. They still exist. You can see them today in a museum in Yangon. These gold plates are more than artifacts. They are proof that the Chuo stood at the center of the Buddhist world. The Chuo economy was extraordinary. Their cities sat at a crossroads. To the west lay India. To the east, China. To the south, the sea routes that connected the entire ancient world. Caravans of silk and porcelain moved through Pew territory on their way from China to the Indian Ocean. Ships loaded with spices and gemstones unloaded at Pew River ports for the long overland journey north. The Pew taxed all of it. And they grew rich. We know they minted some of the first coins in Southeast Asia, silver coins stamped with images of conch shells and rising suns. We know they wore clothing of imported Chinese silk. We know they exported gold, silver, lead, rubies, sapphires, and most valuable of all, petroleum, yes, oil, which seeped naturally from the ground in central Burma and was sold to the Chinese Empire as a medicine and a lamp fuel. A Chinese envoy named Jia Dan, who visited the Pew in the 7th century, wrote a detailed account of what he saw. He described a kingdom where the king lived in a palace of teakwood and gold leaf. Where the soldiers refused to wear armor of iron, they said it was cruel to take the life of an insect, let alone a man, and instead carried only ceremonial weapons. Where the women wore their hair piled high and decorated with flowers and jewels. Where music played at all hours of the day, performed by orchestras of more than 100 musicians using instruments made of jade, ivory, and brass. He described one detail that has haunted historians for over 1,000 years. The Pew, he said, did not have a word for war. But while the Pew were dancing in their cities of gold, something was growing in the mountains to the north. In what is now the Chinese province of Yan'an, a federation of tribes had united under a single king. They called their kingdom Nanzhao, the Southern Kingdom. And by the 8th century, Nanzhao had become the most aggressive military power in mainland Asia. The Tang dynasty of China tried to conquer Nanzhao 3 times. 3 times, Nanzhao destroyed the Chinese army sent against it. By the year 800 AD, Nanzhao was strong enough to think about expansion of its own. It looked south, toward the rich, peaceful, undefended cities of the Pew. The first raids began around 760 AD. They were small at first, cattle stolen, border villages burned. The Pew responded the only way they knew how. They sent gifts. They sent ambassadors. They sent musicians and dancers to entertain the Nanzhao court, hoping to charm their northern neighbors into peace. It did not work. For 70 years, the raids grew larger and bolder. Pew cities began to fortify their walls more heavily. Refugees from the northern cities began to flee south to Sri Kshetra. The Chinese diplomatic records from this period grow increasingly grim. They describe a kingdom of beautiful, civilized, doomed people, watching the storm come and not knowing how to stop it. And then, in 832 AD, the storm arrived. The Nanzhao army, Chinese sources estimate it at over 50,000 men, descended through the river valleys and fell upon the Pew cities one by one. Hallan fell first. The walls were breached. The stupas were torn down. The reservoirs were poisoned. Then Sri Kshetra, the city of splendor. Its 18 square kilometers of brick and gold. The Nanzhao did not loot it and leave. They occupied it. They destroyed the palaces. They smashed the gold plates of the monasteries, though, miraculously, some were buried by monks in time and survived. And then they took the people. A Chinese historian named Fan Chuo, writing only a few decades later, recorded the number with chilling precision. 3,000 Pew were taken in chains to Kunming, in the territory of Nanzhao. They were resettled there as slaves and craftsmen. They were never permitted to return. The fall of Sri Kshetra was not just a military defeat. It was the breaking of an entire civilization. Its cities were emptied. Its temples were silent. Its survivors were scattered across the river valleys. And after that moment, the Pew began to disappear from history. Here is the strangest part of the story. The part that historians cannot fully explain. After 832 AD, the Pew did not simply decline. They vanished. There were survivors. There must have been. Not every Pew lived in the 3 great cities. There were farmers in the countryside, traders in the villages, monks in distant monasteries. They survived the Nanzhao invasion. They continued to live in the same river valleys their ancestors had farmed for 1,000 years. But within 2 centuries, they no longer called themselves Pew. The language they had spoken disappeared. The script they had used, a beautiful, looping alphabet derived from ancient Indian scripts, became unreadable. The architectural style of their stupas was forgotten. The water engineering, the coin minting, the gold plate inscriptions, the orchestras of jade and ivory, all of it, gone. A new people moved into the dry zone of central Burma. They came from the north, like the Puo had once come. They spoke a different language. They built their own city, called Bagan, on the banks of the Irrawaddy. They were the ancestors of the modern Burmese people. And when they looked at the massive ruined walls of Sri Kshetra, just 50 kilometers from their new capital, they did not know who had built them. The Burmese had legends about the ruins. They believed they had been built by giants, or by spirits, or by a long-dead race of kings whose names no human could remember. They sometimes used the bricks to build their own temples, and so, ironically, fragments of the Puo civilization were preserved inside the walls of the Bagan temples that tourists visit today. For 1,000 years, that was all anyone knew. The Puo had become a ghost story. In 1907, a British colonial archaeologist named Charles Duroiselle began excavating a strange circular mound near the modern town of Piari, in central Burma. He had heard stories from local villagers, stories of a city of giants buried beneath the rice fields. What he found stunned the academic world. Beneath the mound was a complete ancient city. Walls, streets, palaces, stupas, reservoirs, coins of a kind no one had ever seen before, inscriptions in a script no one could read. It would take another 50 years before scholars could begin to translate the Puo script, and even today, large portions of it remain undeciphered. We can read the names of kings. We can read some Buddhist invocations. But entire categories of Puo writing, their literature, their poetry, their philosophy, remain locked away in a language no one alive can fully understand. In 2014, UNESCO declared the three great Puo cities, Sri Kshetra, Hallan, and Baekthano, a World Heritage Site. The first World Heritage Site in Myanmar. Today, a handful of archaeologists continue to excavate the ruins. Every year, they find new artifacts, new inscriptions, new burials, new pieces of a civilization that should not have been forgotten, but was. And the mystery deepens. Because we still do not understand why the Puo vanished so completely. The Nanzhao invasion was devastating, yes. But other civilizations have survived devastating invasions. Rome was sacked. China was conquered, repeatedly. Vietnam was occupied by China for 1,000 years and still emerged with its language and culture intact. Why did the Puo not? Why did their language die? Why did their script become unreadable within a few generations? Why did the survivors, and there were survivors, choose, or were forced, to become someone else? Some historians believe the answer lies in something more than just the invasion. They believe that the Puo, in their 1,000-year golden age, had grown so peaceful, so refined, so dependent on trade and ceremony, that when their world was shattered, they had no framework left for survival. The orchestras stopped playing. The temples fell silent. The survivors, scattered and traumatized, simply let go of their language, of their name, of their memory of themselves. Within a few generations, their grandchildren spoke Burmese. Their great-grandchildren did not know they had ever been anything else. And that may be the most haunting part of all. A people can vanish even when their descendants are still alive. There is a Puo inscription, carved into a stone pillar at Sri Kshetra, dating from around the year 700 AD. It is one of the few we can fully translate. It reads, "May this city stand for 10,000 years. May its bells ring forever. May our children's children remember the names of their fathers." The city stood for 200 more years after the inscription was carved. The bells fell silent in 832 AD. And the names of their fathers, almost all of them, are lost. If you enjoyed this story, there are more lost civilizations waiting. In the next video, we'll travel south, to the jungles of central Vietnam, to uncover the kingdom of Kampa. A people who built temples that rivaled Angkor Wat, fought a 1,000-year war against their neighbors, and then, like the Puo, simply ceased to exist. Subscribe so you don't miss it.